There you go. Again, welcome to tonight's LA Birders presentation on swallows. If you're not a member yet of LA Birders, please consider joining us. Go to our website at labirders.org and you can click on join or renew if you're already a member. And your membership helps support these webinars, helps support our science projects and other things we have going on. You can go to our website and see everything that's going on, and we appreciate it. With that, I would like to introduce John Feenstra, who will be introducing our speaker for tonight. John?
Well, all right. So Adam didn't send me a bio, so he kind of left it up to me to figure out. So I started with the internet. And apparently there are Adam Searcys all over the United States, from Arizona to Utah to all the way over to Norfolk, Virginia. But the Adam that I know, and the one that's talking to you tonight, is from Ventura County, California. He's a lifelong naturalist and has been birding since the turn of the most recent millennium. He is a skilled and traveled man and has watched birds through Mexico and the United States and the far-off continent of Australia. His accomplishments are many and include the compilation of the south end of the Salton Sea Christmas bird count, 2 tours of duty on the California Bird Records Committee, and the founding of eCreosote, that until the rise of iNaturalist was the internet's foremost site of tracking and celebrating the humble creosote of the Southwest deserts. Adam's depth and breadth of knowledge of the natural world is substantial, and he can converse fluently from subjects as diverse as the of fish gill parasites, spider genitalia, and subtle points of bird identification, like tonight's talk. So with all of that, ladies and gentlemen, Adam Searcy.
Well, thank you, John. I don't think you missed anything. If you did, I'll let you know. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Adam. I assume some of you have met me, some of you haven't. Well, now you get to meet me. And I'm attempting to share my screen here and start this presentation about swallows. All right. Can everyone see my screen, or can John see my screen?
Yeah, you are
Great.
all set, Adam.
All right. I'm just going to try and minimize all this stuff, these people, to get them out of the way. All right. Swallows. So we're going to talk about the swallows that occur in California. I would love to talk about swallows elsewhere, but there are too many and time is short. So just a quick outline of what we'll cover, just some general advice on swallow identification. And this covers birding identification in general, birding in general. Swallows from non-swallows. We'll quickly cover some things that are kind of like swallows, some birds that are kind of like swallows, I should say. And then also we'll cover swallows and how to tell one species from another, hopefully. And at the end, we'll have some quiz swallows. And it's not really a quiz, it's just some photos that we'll go through and go through identification points and just talk about some weird plumages and weird looking bad photographs, etc. I will warn everyone, there are lots of bad photographs in this presentation. So expectation, we go out and we want to see swallows, we want to see birds, and it's like, oh, we're going to see a bird perched and it's going to be happy and we'll be able to look at all these field marks and see everything. And then sometimes the reality strikes us and it's something like this, where we see thousands of birds. And swallows, this is a particular problem. In warblers, it's like, sure, they can fly by, go to Bear Divide, you might not be able to see half the things flying by, but it's like, oh, there's a black-throated gray hanging out in an oak tree and you can stare at it for a while, but you'll often run into these giant aggregations of swallows and it's like, what do I do? Another one, expectation. Oh, great, here's a lovely northern rough-winged swallow perched. I can see all these detailed field marks. I actually have a quick question. Is my mouse visible to everyone?
Yes, it is.
Great. Okay,
Yes,
I thought so, but I'm kind of old and I don't know how these things work. I just wanted to make sure so I can point things out with my mouse. Wonderful. Reality, something up high, backlit, can't see it. There it goes, it's gone. So, and this is certainly a problem with swallows. It's not always a problem. I mean, you're able to get photographs like this because these birds do stop, they do let you look at them, and sometimes they're foraging right in front of you and you can stare at them for a long time, but it's often not the case. So some general advice. The first thing, I think every ID presentation I've ever given, birding is hard, I think is an important thing, is not my original idea, but a famous bird watcher once said it, and I don't know if it was his original idea, but it is true. And it's not always hard. There are things that are straightforward, of course, and there's a whole spectrum of identification challenges, as we all know, that go from relatively straightforward that beginning birders learn quickly to the much harder things that birders learn later in their birding career or never. Birding is hard. That's what makes it fun. It's a challenge. So part of that is being prepared to not know what everything is and to let some birds go. So swallow spa, if you see that giant flock of swallows that was up a minute ago, you're not going to be able to see all of those birds. You might be in an area where you're really limited to, a couple of species and you might be able to narrow it down, but putting swallow spa on your personal notes is of course fine. And people used to do things like this all the time, but eBird has publicized a lot of our birding birding habits, and it, I think, drives us to try and be more accurate, which is excellent. But we also might not want to admit uncertainty as often, and we need to remember that that's okay, because uncertainty is often just the truth. So swallow spa is fine. If you see a big flock of swallows and you can only identify a small proportion of them, that's great. You can put swallow spa. So don't be afraid to put your uncertainty into your eBird checklists. Another one is just to watch the birds. I swear there will be photos, by the way. This is the first slide that just has some words. It's boring. I'm talking. There'll be photos. Cameras can be a hindrance. I know a lot of us love to take photographs. Swallows are hard to photograph. Viewfinders are not binoculars. If you're trying to identify swallows, there is a lot to be gained by photographing things in the field and then identifying them from the photographs later, but that does not necessarily give you the tools to identify those things in the future from just looking at them. You don't see the flight style, you don't see the details through your binoculars. So I would highly recommend not leaving your camera at home, but making it a point to be sure to just look at the birds. It's important. You lose a lot looking through a viewfinder. I know, I take photos and I have to tell myself sometimes I don't need to photograph this thing. Late summer is a great time to go look at swallows in known breeding and foraging localities. Go to a local sewage pond that has tree swallows, and just go to a place where you know what species are likely to be there and kind of narrow it down. During migration, there's a lot more that could be happening. You could see a flock of, again, 500 birds, and then you're dealing with potentially more than is easily you're easily able to handle. So going places where you have a smaller number of species to look at can be helpful. That was mentioned in a 1985 birding article by Claudia Wilds about unraveling the mysteries of brown swallows. And I think Ken Kaufman, he mentioned basically the exact same thing in his advanced birding guide talking about swallows. Late summer specifically, go places where you know these birds breed and look at them. And then you'll have young birds that are recently fledging. You get to look at the young bird, the plumage of young birds, and you'll see the adults, adult females, adult males, if you can differentiate between the two. So status and distribution is important. Where are you and when are you? If it's January 1st and you're in California and you see a cliff swallow, you should know that that's something that you need to document extraordinarily well, because there are very, very, very few legitimate records of cliff swallows in the actual winter. It's an early migrant, and it can be it can leave late and it can arrive early, but there's this period in winter where cliff swallows are just gone. So don't forget about that. Also, if you're 9,000 feet on a mountain and you see, you're not going to be seeing lowland swallow, you're not as likely to see lowland swallows. So, and of course, common things are common, rare things are rare. With swallows in California, we have seven more expected species and then one very rare species. And then of course there are others that could occur but haven't yet occurred, or at least haven't been documented by birders. So common things are common, rare things are rare. So don't talk yourself into rare things if that's what you're out looking for. Good general birding advice. And getting better at birding and everything takes time, and time takes time. There's some Caltech folks on this talk who might take issue with time taking time. I don't know, maybe that's not true for physics, but I think it's true for learning to be better at identifying birds. So, all right, that's the boring stuff, general birding advice. So here's a segue, a giant flock of swallows. Yeah, so, things you can do when you encounter a giant flock of swallows. If they're perching, get a scope if you have your scope. Try and pick out a bird and just follow it and try and get a general sense of, what the dominant species is. These are mostly tree swallows. And just look at trying to come up with a proportion of the different species, and do this time and time again, and you'll get better and better at picking out flight style details, et cetera. And these are all things that, I mean, flight style, you can't talk about flight style, I don't think, and it can't be given to people. You have to go out in the field and see it. So it's one reason I didn't include video. I think it's also really hard to capture in video. It's not impossible, but it's better just to go out and look at the birds in the field. And that's another, put your camera down, use your binoculars and look at the bird piece of advice, figuring out the way it flies, because swallows don't all fly the same. It's like storm petrels. It's really hard to talk about, but once you see it, it's more obvious. So, all right, so a quick run through some non-swallow birds. I'm not going to talk much about swifts. I think someone else is going to give a presentation about swifts. I think an entire presentation on chimney versus Vox's swift would be helpful it'd be helpful for me. It's a hard pair. So swifts are shaped differently than swallows. They're quite similar. I mean, they have broad bills. They're both adapted to aerial foraging for insects, but their wing shape is different. Their tail and their body is different. These, in field guides are often described as cigars with wings. This is a little bit less cigar shaped than Vox's and chimney swift, has a longer tail, but these long kind of almost rectangular wings, it's not quite the right way to put it, but really short secondaries differ quite a bit from swallows. Here's a Vox's swift on the left and a cliff swallow on the right. Cliff swallow looks more like a bird. Swifts are kind of, I don't know, they look funky, they look weird. They have these little weird fake tails with spikes on them. They have these kind of weird frog mouthy faces. And this cliff swallow has a respectable bird's tail and a more respectable bird's head and a more typical bird-shaped wing, but there are obviously similarities. So, and flight style is really important with swifts versus swallows, and swifts of course have different flight styles between species, but one thing that swifts do is they do a lot of rocky flight and they do a lot of quick fluttering, very kind of choppy fluttering, and swallows generally are more fluid in their flapping and they're a little bit slower and more graceful in their flying. And that's of course differs between different species of swallows, but it's pretty stark if you see a Vox's swift blast through a group of northern rough-winged swallows, because they have a pretty different flight style. Here's another Vox's and a tree swallow on the left, just showing some differences. Again, you have a real tail over here, a little notch in this tail, and some more traditional triangular wings. And then you have these weird little short tails and long sickle-like wings on the swift. Another Vox's swift, this one molting with some fresh feathers here and some older feathers on the outer, or some older primaries, and this fanned tail. Look at this weird tail. These really short rects that rectrices, tail feathers that really contrast with the long outer tail feathers on this tree swallow. I think this tree swallow is lighting a cigarette or something. I'm not sure what's going on here. Another swift versus swallow. These are two species that can have white rumps. I mentioned lots of bad photos, and I did that for two reasons. Well, the main reason is that you don't see swallows 10 feet away from you sitting still very often. You see swallows distantly, and blurry photos and distant photos, I think, can be better at illustrating what you're going to see in the field. I once saw a photo that someone took of a an ashy storm petrel that was so close and so crisp and so detailed that the plumage puzzled me, because you could see these ashy gray details, these things that you never see from a boat. And that photograph was beautiful to show you what an ashy storm petrel looks like if you're 2 feet away from it, but it was not an accurate representation of what you're going to see with binoculars on a moving boat. So crummy, blurry photos, but this is a very identifiable swallow on the left. It's a violet green swallow. It's got these big white rump patches, that nice white face, and it's green and violet on the back. And then we have a white-throated swift on the right, just showing the differences and some structural differences. Here's another pair. We have a black swift on the left, a very silhouetted black swift, and then we have a purple martin on the right. Vaguely similar. They're both large, dark aerial foraging birds, but long head on this purple martin. Again, a more traditional wing shape. That doesn't really mean anything. I kind of made that up to be funny. And a more traditional tail shape, as opposed to this kind of weird tail. And black swifts do have tail forks. It's just not visible here. It's variable by age and sex. And here's this thing. Is it a black swift? Is it a purple martin? It has a yellow bill. It is a European starling. It is a very distant, blurry, crummy photo of a European starling. I was quite surprised at how poor the flight photos were in the places I looked for European starling flight photos, including my own photo collection. But yeah, starlings, can be mistaken for swallows. One thing that they do is they do fast, direct flight. They'll flap, 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 fly, flap, 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 fly. And they usually only do fancy gliding stuff if they're in a giant group trying to evade a predator. So, all right, what species are we dealing with here? So California, we have tree swallow, violet green swallow, northern rough-winged swallow, bank swallow, barn swallow, cliff swallow, cave swallow, and purple martin. These are not in taxonomic order. These are in the order that I decided to present them. So we're going to start with tree swallow. Oh, just real quickly, all of these species breed in California except cave swallow. And cave swallow is, of course, you know, the rare swallow. There are some other possibilities that I mentioned earlier, but we're not going to cover because they haven't occurred and the likelihood is very small. That could be its own whole presentation. Potential vagrant swallows to the west. So we're going to start with tree swallow. And here's, so I mentioned earlier, going out in summer, going to breeding locations. If you go somewhere that you know has breeding tree swallows, I don't know the situation in Los Angeles County. I don't know the best place to go to see breeding tree swallows. Ventura County has some great spots. Saticoy settling ponds, the Ventura treatment ponds, both have nest boxes. This bird has also started to use natural cavities along the Santa Clara River again, which it had been excluded from by both habitat change and also starlings and other things competing with their nest cavities, but it's coming back slowly. But there's some nice places to go look at these birds, and you can see them like this because they do a lot of perching around their breeding habitats. So some quick points about tree swallows. Adults, dark metallic blue above and white below. They're blue and they're white. Males from females, I'm not going to talk a lot about sexing swallows. I mean, a lot of them you just can't sex in the field. There might be some measurement differences. Tree swallows, if you see a pair at a nest box, you often can age them, or sorry, sex them, but sometimes you can't. And it's not variation that is hugely important for identification, but just interesting information to know. Some female male pairs, it's obvious, but there are females that overlap the plumage of males. So immature birds, they have a similar pattern to adults, but they're much drabber. They're kind of just brownish gray above. They lack blue. And they may have a dusky breast band, and it's darkest on the outside of the breast band. It's on the outer edges, and it's never as clear cut as something like a bank swallow, which we'll cover later. All plumages have a sharp cheek throat contrast, which we'll see in a second. We're going to go through all these points with photographs. No need to memorize all of these things. There will not be a test at the end, unless LA Birders has a test that I don't know about. They have pretty broad wings and a short notch tail, not a deep swallow tail, swallow-like tail, and a small amount of white on sides of the rump, but not as much as you see on violet green swallow. So just covering some of those points. Dark face, they have this nice dark mask offset by dark blue above, clean, sharp contrast to the white throat and lower part of the face, and no white coming up behind the eye, and then just clean white below elsewhere. So here's an example of a female on the right and a male on the left, and this is at a nesting location, and this is a pretty obvious difference. And females get bluer as they age. So a second-year female is less blue than a third-year female. I don't know if that's always the case, but it's often the case. And this is with banded birds at of known age and sex that people have looked at, which is just an interesting thing in and of itself. One thing to think about with swallows that can be helpful for identification. It's not terribly helpful in many cases, but molt. 4 of our species generally start molting on the summering grounds and during migration, and they might complete molt on the wintering grounds, and then 4 other species generally molt on their wintering grounds. And that corresponds to distance. And there are geographic differences, though, between species. Northern rough-winged swallows in the east have different molt timing than northern rough-winged swallows in the west. Tree swallow is one that that often starts molting on the breeding grounds. This is a bird that I photographed on Santa Barbara Island. I included it not because it's a good photo, because it's not, but because it shows obvious feather different ages of feathers. These old worn primaries, and these are all fresher replaced primaries, and then here are some secondaries that are not replaced. So one species that this is important for, or can be important for, is cliff swallow versus cave swallow. Cliff swallows are very long distance migrants, and they don't molt in California or in the West. I don't think they've ever been recorded molting there. Maybe that's not true. Maybe they have, but it's very rare. It's very unlikely. They generally are going to molt after migration on their wintering grounds, versus cave swallow, which could be seen molting in California or in North America in its breeding range. And the only cave swallows I've seen in California were in late fall in the Salton Sea area, and they were molting. Surprise, surprise. Now, those birds were wintering there, which kind of complicates the picture, but cliff swallows don't winter there. Just something to think about is molt timing. It's, again, not terribly important. It's also just interesting. Ryan Terrell will probably send me an email later telling me that I'm wrong about some part of this, but that's okay. So here we have some tree swallows. These are not blue, they are brown. These are young tree swallows. So the bird on the left has, and this breast dinginess is quite variable. The bird on the right, it's not facing directly at us, but very white breast compared to this bird on the left, which has this dinginess. And you can see it's dark on the outside, paler on the inside. And it's never a clear-cut, well-defined breast band like you see on bank swallow. But one thing you can see here is this nice, clean face pattern that really mimics the adult face pattern of a dark mask. It's brown here, but a dark mask that's offset by this clean white below. Here are some more juvenile tree swallows, or young tree swallows. These could be informative plumage. Young tree swallows, immature tree swallows, very dark cap, dark, clear contrast. And then again, you see this variation in breast dinginess, this kind of faint breast band on the left and white here and a little bit dingier over here on the right. Here's some more. This one, you have a nice clue of this adult tree swallow with these young tree swallows. Nice clean mask, all brown above, none of the blue of adults. Really going at it with the tree swallows. Nice mask, clean cut, and some adults to help cement your identification. Now, adults next to young birds does not necessarily mean that they belong or that they are the same species, but if they just fledged, it would be a good hint. And here's just a fun little factoid about tree swallows. They can eat fruits, and they winter further north regularly than most other, all of our other swallows. And the ability to eat fruits during winter is one of the reasons they can do that, which is a pretty neat little fact. Wax myrtle fruits in particular. So, all right, violet green swallow. Also, of the swallows we've mentioned so far, other than cave swallow, most of them are pretty widely distributed throughout North America. So a lot of these identification tips can help you in your birding travels in the United States. I should say the United States and Canada. But violet green swallow is an exception to that in that it's more, it's a Western bird. It's a bird of mountains and dense riparian areas on the coast from this area north, et cetera. So kind of a Western specialty, which is neat. So the violet green swallow, adult males, bright green violet above. Well, they're actually violet green above. Otherwise, it would be a green violet swallow. That's a typo on my part. Sorry. Clean white below. Narrow, long wings. They have a short tail, and their wings, when they're perched, will extend beyond their tail tip quite noticeably. Males are brighter than females. Females are kind of just a dingy version of male plumage. They look pretty similar, though. We'll look at that in a second. The white on the face extends from the rear of the face up and over the eye. Immature birds have similar patterns, including that white up and over the eye, but they're brown. They're very dusky brown, and that lasts until they start their first molts and start to get some more adult-like plumage and get some color. All ages of plumages have white rump patches, and these are quite striking. This is a really good field mark. They're not the only swallow in the world that has that, but they're our only regular swallow. I should say they're our only swallow. There's some exceptions, but they've never occurred in California, so we're going to ignore them. So some of those field marks, we have the white extending around the back of the face, up above the eye. They have this nice little small black mask, violet and green upper parts. I put them in the correct order this time, and gleaming white below. This is a nice male violet green swallow. Here's another male. You can't really see the tail terribly well here, but you can see how long these wings are. Violet and green above, nice white face. Here's a female. This is at a nesting locality in the mountains. And you can see it mimics the face pattern of the male, dark mask, white on the face, a little bit of white wrapping up, but it's all dusky and dingy. So if you see this bird next to an adult male, it's quite strikingly, the differences between the two are quite striking. But yeah, this is what females look like. And here's another female showing, again, mimicking that male face pattern, but just with some duskiness to the plumage. And the green and the violet is usually more subdued. I don't know what the potential overlap is for brightness on the back of male versus female. And here's an adult male in flight. And you can see those bright white rump patches. And these are variable. Sometimes they can even touch on the rump, but usually there's a little separation of dark feathering between the two. But it's these big kind of saddlebag patches on the back, around the on the rump sides. And then you see the white extending up and over the eye here. Violet and green. And here's a bad photo, no offense to Macrybopsis, I'm sorry. But you can see that nice white rump, dark tail. You can't really see the violet and green, but you don't need to because you can see the white extending over the eye, and you can see this white rump here. So here's another one. Look at those. If you pretend these are eyes and this is a nose, it's like, I don't know, some kind of weird dog face or something facing the other way. Now I can't unsee it. It's flying backwards. So I'm going to move on to the next. So these are some funky looking young violet green swallows. Actually, this is the same bird. It's just two photographs of it having turned. And you can see these really long wings, shorter tail, and just all brown. There's no violet or green coming in, but you do see this nice face pattern that mimics the adults. Dark brown mask, white above the eye, and you can see the hint of the white rump patch that would be visible in flight. So here it is just versus a tree swallow. And these birds seen right next to each other, they're quite strikingly different. The face pattern is often really striking. Again, this dark mask, no white around the eye on the tree swallow. Dark mask, just the lores in front of the eye, and then this nice white hook coming up around the above the eye. And tree swallows they can have some greenish, but they tend to be more blue and darker than violet green swallows. So, all right. Oh, one thing I was going to mention about tree and violet green swallows, and I'll mention this about all of them, I just forgot about those. Those are both cavity nesters, and they both nest in tree cavities generally, or nest boxes. And there are distinct differences in the nesting habits of our swallows. So those are both cavity nesters. And here we have another cavity nester, but not a tree cavity nester, the northern rough-winged swallow. And this bird nests in cavities in bridges. Historically, it would have nested in cavities in banks, etc. But it's not colonial like bank swallow, which we'll cover later. So it will nest by itself. A fun place in Santa Barbara, I saw it. I would see northern rough-winged swallows nesting. There was a big vertical retaining wall. Geez, a retaining wall. Vertical doesn't need to be mentioned. That had these pipes going into it. And it would nest in just these little pipes going into this retaining wall that drained the parking lot above it. So just one or two pairs nesting in this entire wall. They love nesting under bridges where white-throated swifts also nest. So northern rough-winged swallows, they're brown. There are consistently brownest swallow. Other species in immature plumages are very brown, but these are brown just year-round. There's one exception to that, immature birds, which we'll cover in a second, but very brown. Evenly brown above with a brown face, brown breast, a whitish belly. It becomes whitish as you go down away from the breast, and then very white undertail, and that can really stand out when they're in fresh plumage. This is a stocky swallow with broad wings and a pretty short tail. The sexes are alike, you can't tell them apart. Immature birds you can tell apart, and they have these beautiful cinnamon-edged flight feathers, which we'll see later. So brown flight feathers, brown back, brown tail, brown rump, brown face, brown head, extending to a dingy brown breast, becoming less brown as you go down towards the belly, and then nice white undertail coverts. And these white undertail coverts can really show, especially during the breeding season. I don't know if they are bigger during the breeding season or if they can flare them out, but sometimes when they're flying around nesting areas, they'll be really obvious, including from above and striking. And I assume it has to do with display. What I mentioned earlier, nesting sites. Here's a pipe that presumably is a nesting site for this northern rough-winged swallow, which is pretty neat that they've adapted to using these weird little pipes that we've built. When they perched it, they look like, I don't know, they look like peewees or something to me when they perch. They just, I don't know, they look weird. But on this bird, you can see again, just kind of indistinct, brownish, dusky all over the face. A little bit of brown on the breast. This shadow is a little bit misleading. It's not part of the bird's plumage, but just brown overall. And here's another one, very brown. And they're called rough-winged swallows because they have these weird hooks on the leading edge of their primaries. Last I checked, we don't know, well, I don't know why those hooks exist. Last I checked, but my reference was a bit old, maybe a decade old. We still don't have a good explanation for why why they have so-called rough wings. And they're not the only species that has that. There's a southern rough-winged swallow. But if anybody later wants to chime in and has updated information, I'd be really interested in hearing about that. Because yeah, it's one of those things, it's not a field mark. It's like we called it a northern rough-winged swallow. That doesn't help us identify it. You can't see the rough wings. So here's one in flight, uniform brown upper side. Here's a fanned tail. They don't really have a significant, they have a very faint, like a minimal notch, but not really a swallow tail. And then you can see the white rump, the white undertail coverts sticking out on this bird on the sides, which again, during the breeding season can be really obvious. Yeah, uniform brown. And beware of lighting. This bird is getting hit by some sunlight, and you see a lot of detail here that you don't always see depending on the lighting situation. Here's another nice, evenly brown above, nice white undertail coverts, just plain brown face. There's no clear contrast like you'll see in tree swallow, no white wrapping up around behind the auriculars like you'll see in bank swallow, which we'll cover later. Dusky brown extending onto the breast, pretty plain brown face, white undertail coverts, northern rough-winged swallow. You can almost make out the rough-winged here, rough-winged. Maybe it is a field mark, if that photograph was better. So here are some young rough-winged swallows. You can still see the yellow edges of the mouth. Young birds have fancy colored mouths when they gape to beg for food from adults, which they lose as they age. And you can see some of the cinnamon edging to these fresh feathers on these young birds. And here's a really cinnamony one, which is a really neat thing to see. And you can see the yellow gape here too. All right, northern rough-winged swallow. The bank swallow. This is a scarce and declining bird in California. Used to breed more widely, has been lost as a breeding species from many counties. Used to breed in Ventura County, but channelization of rivers, loss of steep sandy banks, certainly part of it. This is also one that is, there are multiple subspecies, but this is a bird that's found in the Northern Hemisphere on other continents as well. The sand martin is what it's called elsewhere. There are also other members of this group that are different than bank swallow that occur elsewhere. But so some field marks to look for on the bank swallow. This is always a treat to see wherever I've lived anyway. Maybe in some places it's more common, but I think it's a treat to see in LA as well. I know it is. So brown upper parts, like northern rough-winged swallow, clean white underparts, cleaner white going up towards the breast and belly, other than this clear breastband. Clean brown breastband. It usually has a spike that goes down towards the belly, which we'll see it here in the photographs. And there's no white extending up the sides of the rump like we see on some of the other brown swallows, like young tree swallows that have a little bit of a rump patch. I call it's not really like a Manx shearwater, but there's a pale white patch that comes up and hooks around behind the auriculars. I said behind the eye, that's not really accurate. It's behind the auriculars. Males and females look the same. Immature birds look very similar. In fresh plumage, they have kind of frosty edging to the upper feathers, but I think that's matched pretty much by freshly plumaged adults. Maybe there's some subtle differences, but not anything that's of concern to identification. They're small. This is also our smallest swallow, California's smallest swallow. They have a pretty decent tail fork too, which I didn't mention there. But so here's that same bank swallow from the first photograph with some of the field marks listed. Clean brown breastband. We have the spike, which is just barely visible here. It's just kind of a subtle dark chunk of little bits. It's not really a clean spike, and it can be a lot cleaner. It's variable. Otherwise, white underparts, brown upperparts, pretty evenly brown. They're a little bit paler on the back and rump. And then this thing that I call the Manx comma. This is just how I remember it. Maybe it won't help anybody else. Maybe it'll confuse people and they'll start thinking these are shearwaters or something like that, but hopefully not. So this white extends up around behind the auriculars. Brown face, but not a clear-cut brown mask like you see on tree swallow. And also notice that the brown feathering extends down at an angle from the eye, whereas on a tree swallow, it extends kind of straight back. And it's much more clear cut with that dark mask offset from the white throat and rest of the face. So this is what they nest in. And this is a colonial nester. So they're a colonial bank nester, and they nest in these holes. This photograph is actually from Russia, which is cool. And it shows you that they look more or less the same there as they do here. So I mentioned clean cut, the breastband. This is not a terribly clean cut breastband, but compared to a tree swallow, it's a lot more well-defined. Maybe generally well-defined is probably a better way to put it. And this is a lot darker than you would ever see on a young tree swallow. And it also has this nice spike coming down the front, and then otherwise white below. And there's that little tail notch, decent tail fork. So here's one flying, a distant kind of crummy photo. No offense to Steve. You can't really see much detail with the tail. You can see some brown, the brown upper tail and slightly paler rump. White below, dark breastband. You can't see that it extends all the way, and you can't see any spike, but you can see this white wrapping up behind the auriculars. And then not a clean-cut mask of dark brown, but dark brown that extends kind of blurrily down towards the breast. And here's looking straight up at a bank swallow. Nice dark breastband, obvious spike, notched tail or slightly forked tail, however you want to put it. Otherwise white, white below. So here again, we can see that nice little pale coming up. And I don't think this is a field mark. It's mentioned in Sibley, but I don't think it's emphasized in a lot of field guides. But if you don't, I mean, if you get a photo of this bird or just see it like this and you don't ever see it bank towards you, bank. It's not why they're called bank swallows. All swallows bank. But you don't see the dark breastband, you don't see the spike. This is a completely identifiable bird in this posture. This is the only view or only photograph you got. Just based on this face pattern and this little bit of white coming up the auriculars, this notched tail. And this photograph shows the slightly paler rump and back compared to the darker wings. Not obvious on, not always obvious, but. One more, can't see the complete breastband, but you can see that white wrapping up behind the face. You can see that nice little tail fork, little paler rump and back, otherwise white underparts. Here's a rough-winged swallow on the right, a northern rough-winged swallow, I should say, and a bank swallow on the left. Dark breast, dark spike, little forked tail. You can't see the tail on the rough-winged swallow, but it would not have that deep of a fork. I guess if it had lost some central rects or something like that, maybe it could show, but it has just this general dusky brown breast fading to white undertail coverts down here, and then does not have the white wrapping up around behind the auriculars, just has a generally brownish, dusky brownish face with a slightly paler throat. All right, barn swallow, a lot of folks' favorite. Well, maybe not a lot of folks' favorite, I don't know. I just assume it is. I like barn swallows. Who doesn't like barn swallows? You can leave if you don't like barn swallows. I guess you can stay. Barn swallow adults are slaty blue above, and they're white to buffy to orange below, quite variable. And there are some average differences in between males and females, but we'll talk about that here in a second. They have a nice chestnut or tawny forehead and throat with a variable dark border below the throat, usually not much, just right at the base of that. They might have some dark feathers, and on the sides, they usually have dark feathers. And that's our barn swallows. Eurasian barn swallows look different. I will mention a little bit about Eurasian barn swallows briefly a little bit later. They have a long forked swallowtail. They're our only swallow that has a really long swallowtail, and it has white tail spots. They're also our only species that has white tail spots, and we'll see photos of that here in a sec. Immatures look like drabber adults with shorter tails. That's putting it very simplistically. They're pretty variable. I've seen some really weird young barn swallows that don't have really any of the swallowtail of an adult. They just have really short tails, and they can really throw you for a loop if you get a bad look at them. So to be aware of weird looking barn swallows, and we'll see some photos of them here in a second. Males and females, they differ on average. The colors can overlap. Males can be white below, males can be orange below, males can be buffy below. They do have average differences in tail length and wing size, but you obviously can't always see that in the field. So there's a lot of variation we see, and we can't always sex them. If you find a nest somewhere and you see a male, an adult male or adult female, then you can sex them, but you often can't. And that's okay. It's not terribly relevant to identification because a lot of the field marks carry over to both sexes. So yeah, nice chestnut forehead patch here and throat, fading to a little bit more tawny below, and then the little blue coming down on the sides. This particular bird has kind of buffy to tawny underparts. Tawny, I guess, is the color I'd call that. But yeah, they can range from deep orange to pure white, and then a nice slate blue upper side. Dark wings, can't see the tail here. All those same field marks are visible here, except the tail. This bird's a little bit paler on the underside. You see the little dark coming in on the underside of this breast patch, forehead patch here, throat patch. They also have a dark mask, which I didn't really mention, but, and then slate blue above. So a Eurasian tree swallow, I'm sorry, God, second time I've done that. Everything isn't tree swallows, Adam. That's the point of this whole talk. A Eurasian barn swallow, they have a much more distinct and larger dark border to this patch. They also tend to be white, more white below. And there are no records from California. There are records from Alaska, very few records, and there are some records from Washington. I don't think Oregon. I don't think British Columbia, but I'm not sure. Someone who knows on the chat can yell at me if I'm wrong. So to be looked for, but again, earlier, like we said, most of the barn swallows you see are going to be our barn swallows. So don't go running out trying to find a Eurasian barn swallow. But if you see something that looks suspicious, definitely take photographs, but not too many photographs. Make sure to look at the birds too. I'm giving a lot of conflicting advice. I apologize. So here's a perched barn swallow showing long tail extending beyond the wingtips. This bird's quite a bit wider below, but again shows this little bit of blue coming down towards this tawny breast patch. So if this was a Eurasian barn swallow, you'd expect this to be a much larger chunk of blue right here, which we're not seeing. A much darker individual with darker belly, much more tawny, and then more dark feathering below this upper breast patch here. Dark mask, blue cap. Here's a very white bird below. Slate blue above, tawny forehead, tawny throat. So here's a young bird. You can see, like I mentioned earlier on those young northern rough-winged swallows, this nice yellow gape is still visible, but it mimics the adult pattern. You have this dark mask. You have what will be a bold tawny patch on the forehead that's just kind of buffy here. And then the throat and upper breast patch is similar. You even have the dark feathering coming in here, slate blue above. Really nothing of the adult tail showing yet. This bird probably has a tail fork that you just can't see because it's perched, but nothing of the long tail that you'll see later. This is a bird that is probably less than a week or two out of the nest. So here's an adult in flight showing those white tail spots I mentioned earlier, which are really obvious when the bird fans its tail, and these really long outer tail feathers. So yeah, it's our only swallow that has this really swallowtail tail. Slate blue above, you can see that here, and yeah, cool white tail spots. Pretty broad-winged swallow as far as our species go. Another darker tawny bird below, obvious giant swallowtail, white tail spots. And this is a plumage that is hard to mistake for anything else. Just one more in flight. So here's a young bird with a short tail, kind of a, hints of the adult pattern on the throat and the breast. I think it's our only swallow that has buffy underwings as well. Here's another young bird. You can see that yellow gape again, showing the beginnings of adult patterning, short tail. And if that tail isn't seen well, if it's not fanned out, you can get some misreads on these birds. If you see a little bit of dark here, it can throw you for a loop and make you think it's something else. All right, purple martin. This is another rare and declining species in our part of the world. Well, in multiple parts of the world. Used to nest in a lot more places than it does now. Still regular in a handful of places. Santa Barbara has at least one, or I think only one regular locality. San Luis Obispo has a handful. Always a treat to see, and a scarce migrant. Adult males are just beautiful glossy purple, appearing black all over. And adult females, and females differs between different subspecies, but adult females have some purple on the back and some purple on the cap and darker underparts than young birds, darker underparts, including undertail coverts in the eastern birds. California females are quite a bit whiter, and they look quite a bit more like immature birds. This is our largest swallow species. They're really big. So immature birds, dark face, dark back, and dark flight feathers, kind of a dingy dark gray breast, and then quite a bit of white on the belly down to the undertail coverts with some just fine dark streaking on the undertail coverts. So here's just an adult male, glossy, purple black. long tail. To me, it's like their tail sticks way out before the feathers even start coming out of the tail. They have this, I don't know, it's kind of a weird rear end, and then a pretty big head too. Real broad triangular wings. Here's a young bird from, this is an eastern bird. Large head, long tail, really white below. So an eastern female would be quite a bit darker below. An adult female, I should say. This could be a female. It's a young bird though. So here's an adult eastern female showing how dingy gray they are below, and they have some of the purplish of males on the head and the back, and then nice dark undertail coverts. And here's a western adult female. Quite a bit whiter below, but still has quite a bit of dark cap, dark mask. And here's an eastern male and female together. And here's some young'uns, eastern young'uns, quite white below. Another question I had for myself while looking at this is I don't know the status of eastern purple martins in California. I don't know if we have documented records of eastern purple martins, or if anybody tries to identify the subspecies. They can be tough. A potential purple martin lookalike, not when perched with a bright yellow bill, but when flying. Mentioned starling earlier, and they're glossy purple green. They're dark, but they don't really fly. They have triangular wings, but something to be looking out for. Purple martins forage really high, and they forage like swallows. They do a lot of gliding, and European starlings don't do fancy gliding when they're foraging. They do that direct flap, flap, flap glide, flap, flap, flap glide. And if they are doing fancy gliding, it's usually if they're in a giant flock with a bunch of other birds trying to escape a predator. So, but beware. All right, cliff swallow. Do a time check here. Okay. So cliff swallow, one of our favorite mud. Oh, I forgot earlier. I was mentioning. So this is another cavity nester, purple martin, and we're moving into and barn swallow. I forgot to mention. So barn swallow builds an open cup mud nest, kind of like a phoebe nest on a ledge, not an enclosed nest like a cliff swallow, just like a mud and straw cup. So we've moved to the mud nesters, and I inserted purple martin in for some reason that made sense to me several days ago. So cliff swallows nest, as we all know, in these jug-shaped mud nests in eaves and under bridges, or under eaves and under bridges. So probably the most famous swallow nest. Cliff swallows are a stocky swallow. They have a short and pretty squared tail, not really a big, no deep fork. Above, dark wings and tail with a pale buffy rump, and that rump really sticks out. They have a dark throat and a pale collar extending up around behind the head. Dark cap with a pale headlight on the forehead. That bright forehead really stands out. I say beware other subspecies. There's a Mexican subspecies that breeds up into southeastern Arizona that hasn't occurred in California, but I suppose could, but is to be looked out for, especially if you're hunting for cave swallows. Males and females are alike as adults, or as immatures and adults. And the immatures are quite variable. They can look really weird too. They look somewhat like drab adults. They don't have the bright headlight forehead patch. They're often really buffy below, and they, they're really variable. I would recommend just going to a cliff swallow colony, and that's an easy thing to find in the summer, and just looking at young birds is the best way to get a handle on the variation of young cliff swallows, or to start to get a handle. I don't know if anyone could ever get a handle on the variation in birds, a complete handle. So we have that bright white forehead patch, that headlight, which again is really obvious, offset by this dark cap, dark face, dark chestnut throat with dark feathering on the bottom of the throat. Here's a pair of adults clinging to a wall, presumably thinking about starting to build a nest, or thinking about something else. Who knows what they're thinking about? Maybe they're thinking about gravity waves. So they have this nice dark iridescent feathering on the back that's not always obvious in the field, but it does. You can see that it's different than the flight feathering in the field often, because it lacks the flight feathers lack iridescence. That beautiful buffy to tawny rump, nice chestnut throat, little dark patch here. So here they are collecting mud in a saltwater location. These are salt marsh snails. That's not what they're that might be what they're officially called, but John mentioned a lot of things earlier. He did not mention malacology as being one of my specialties, although I have been dabbling a lot in native land snails, but these are marine snails, so sorry. I'll have to have someone give a talk on marine snails. So yeah, these cliff swallows are collecting mud to take to their nest. A really neat thing, if you look at nests of any of these mud building swallows, you can see if they move mud sources as they're building their nest, like if the mud dries up, you'll see distinct bands of different colors of mud. Sometimes you'll see like a pale gray, then a gray, and then a reddish mud. So it's kind of cool. So here's a cliff swallow in flight. Nice white forehead, dark cap. We've got this nice collar extending all the way around behind the head. Dark back, less dark than the flight feathers. Nice buffy rump and then a dark tail. Another view of an adult showing those characters. You can see the iridescent back feathers here and some of this pale feathering on the back. White headlight, dark cap. Yeah, here you can see it's just a nice respectable fanned tail. So here's a cliff swallow photographed at the same location showing lighting differences and how much darker the back looks out of direct sunlight. That's something to always, any birding you're doing, lighting is important, but swallows doing all of the tipping and tilting that they do, lighting can really play a big part in how they appear. Violet green swallow in cloudy weather looks a lot different than a violet green swallow in bright sunny weather. Those iridescent feathers really don't stick out as much in cloudy weather. Here's just one showing this main field mark of that white forehead coming right at you. You can see the dark throat, you can see other stuff, but you don't really need to. Here's a young cliff swallow. This bird is barely out of the nest. It's got like some kind of bug in its mouth, maybe an ant. I don't know what that is, a wasp, termite. I'm going with termite. And yeah, it shows a dark throat. It shows that beginning of a collar. It shows the dark cap. And you can see the yellow gape because it's a young bird. And you can see that it has a buffy rump here. You can just barely see the top of it. Yeah, young cliff swallows can look weird. Beware. Here's another young bird. This is in summer in Central California. All dark face and cap, dark throat, collar extending around behind the back of the head, and buffy rump. That's really all you can see here. Summer, looking at swallows in summer. It's a great thing to do. Here we have a cave swallow. And I debated how much to cover cave swallows, but I know everybody's going to want to know about cave swallows. And it's like, I'm going to cover the 7 regular species and I can't leave cave swallow out. It just didn't seem fair. It would have been rude. So cave swallows are most similar to cliff swallows. They're the same genus. And they also have dark wings and a dark tail. They have a tawny rump that's darker than a cliff swallow. They have a dark cap and dark chestnut on the forehead and a pale throat. Dark chestnut on the forehead in contrast with the white forehead headlight that you see on a cliff swallow. Males and females are alike. And then immatures are really buffy below. They're variable as well. They're buffy on the throat and nape as well. And then they have a dark cap and a mask, which is quite different from what you see on cliff swallows. So yeah, here's an adult. You see this clear dark mask. Forehead color matches, well, almost matches the throat color. This is a little bit paler. This nice, neat offset cap here. So yeah, lacking that white forehead headlight. And then it does not have as dark of a throat and doesn't have any dark feathering below the throat like you see on cliff swallows. Here's another example. Dark mask, tawny forehead, no dark throat patch here, buffier below. That's tawny, it's not really buffy. Here's a whole mix of cave swallows sitting on a line. Yeah, this is a very rare bird in California. We don't have very many records. I think it's still fewer than 18 records, 15, 20, somewhere in that range. 10 to 100. My credences are high that it's about 18, but I'd have to look it up. Yeah, so it's not an expected bird at any time or place in California, but to be looked for. Texas is the place to go if you want to, a good place to go if you want to see these breeding in the ABA area. Again, no white on forehead, chestnut. And I mentioned Mexican cliff swallows, which here in the United States breed into Southeast Arizona. I highly recommend seeking out next time you're there. I know birders don't pay much attention to subspecies, but it's really neat to see a very different looking cliff swallow because they have a dark chestnut forehead patch, but they also have a dark throat and dark feathering here, which differs quite a bit from what you see on a cave swallow, but worth seeking out if you're in next time you're in Southeast Arizona. But yeah, no dark throat patch here. And then this lack of white forehead patch. And here, so cave swallows build nests very similar to cliff swallows, but they're not quite a closed jug. They're more closed than you see on barn swallows, which are more of an open cup. They're like this, mostly closed, half closed. So they're on their way to building a respectable cliff swallow nest, but they're still building these cave swallow nests, which is pretty neat. Just another example of the dark face mask and tawny throat, no dark on the lower part of the throat. Another example, I didn't know, I think I'd forgotten how many cave swallow pictures I put in here. And then, wow, I really forgot how many I put in here. We're just rolling through. I guess I want everyone to see cave swallows. So this photo, I think this shows that dark mask, and the pale throat compared to a cliff swallow and lack of white. It shows that all really well. And compared to a cliff swallow, this bird would really stand out. And here's one just showing the darker rump. And that is not a great field mark, but if you saw them side by side, but if all you see is the rump, it's not gonna be enough. Describing the rump of a cave swallow and submitting it to the CBRC is probably not gonna get you where you wanna be. So here's a side by side. So you can see the forehead difference is obvious. And the throat and face is darker chestnut on the cliff swallow and this much paler on the cave swallow. And there's no darker patches on the throat here. So side by side, adults look quite different. Immatures of both can be weird. There was an August bird photographed in California a number of years ago that was ultimately rejected, but looked quite a bit like a young cave swallow. So there are weird, from an extremely qualified observer who will remain unnamed. All right. I don't know if you all usually break for questions or have questions at the end. I think there'll be time for questions at the end. I also didn't really get a time limit, so I'm just going to keep rolling. It's only 8. So, all right, I heard somebody. Ron, do you want to chime in?
No, I was going to answer your question, but you're rolling. Go for it.
Yeah, it's so quiet and I can't see anybody that partway through that, I got some existential dread of what if I'm talking and there's just no one here and everything else, everybody's gone. But you've talked now, so I'm reassured, so I'll continue. So yeah, I was just gonna roll into some practice birds, which I just don't have the names up, and I'm not asking people to speak up or anything like that. You can just talk in your head to yourself or to whoever you're watching this with, assuming anybody's even left watching it, about what the identifications are of some of these birds. So yeah, and I mentioned earlier, I have a lot of bad photos, and I did intentionally include blurry photos, distant photos, etc., because I think it's just more realistic for identification. A photo salon of Adam's my photos, I forgot to mention too, my photos were all too good for an identification presentation. They were all just too close and too crisp, and they just did not represent the birds as one sees them in life. So I decided to use, poorer photographs. None of that is, of course, true. Well, maybe 2% of that is true. But I do think it's more instructive to look at, somewhat crummy photographs. So on the left, we have a bird that shows some field marks that should allow us to identify it. We have a dark mask. We can see some iridescent blue showing through, and we have clean white underparts, pretty decent little tail fork, but nothing substantial. And that clean cut dark mask and slaty blue and kind of broad wings and a little bit of a fork tail points to a tree swallow. On the right, we have a bird that shows not much, but it does show a very clear hook of white coming up behind the eye to above the eye. We can't really see much color on the bird. We can't really interpret the tail, and the wing shape is, not really ascertainable at this angle, but the only species we have locally that has that white hook coming up around the back of the eye is the violet green swallow. So here's a trio of, is there any way for me to move this thing on the top here? Sorry. Okay, it's fine. Oh, there it is. Nope, sorry. I'm just trying to hide floating media controls. There we go, they're gone. I can't see the top of the screen, but now I can. So here we have a trio of birds flying over what I assume is water. And we'll start with the bird on the top. We can see a little bit of color. We see some bluish and some greenish, and we see white below, and we see a very clean horizontal mask bordered by white below, which points us all to tree swallow. On the left, we have a bird that shows, can't see the face terribly well, but you can make out that white comes up around and above the eye, and you can very clearly see these large white flank rump patches on the sides of the rump, which points us to violet green swallow, the nice little notched tail. Then down here in the bottom right, we have a bird that's very buffy below, buffy underwing coverts, dark chestnut on the throat. I swear you can see it. And I swear you can see that it's slaty blue above. You cannot really see the tail. I can't even tell if this bird has a tail, but that is a barn swallow. Nobody else we have is going to be that buffy below with that dark throat patch. Here we have a bird that's pretty brown to, I don't even know what to call this color. It's not really brown. It's maybe dusky, approaching black. A little bit of white coming up on the sides of the rump, but not a ton. And we have a very dark mask. And there is a little bit of white coming up around the back of the auriculars, which is, I think, a little bit misleading on this bird, but that really clear mask points to, and lack of blue above points to young tree swallow. And a pretty straight tail, no really appreciable fork in the tail. Young tree swallow. Summer, go look at those tree swallows. Here's a high flying bird, no forked tail, big stocky triangular wings, pretty pale buffy below, a little bit of dark here on the upper breast, going into a dark chestnut throat. I can imagine seeing a tiny bit of white above the bill there that all point to cliff swallow. This was photographed this week in San Luis Obispo. Here's a weird one. I mentioned earlier some weird plumages of various swallows. Let's start at the top. We have dark above, extending to some dark patches onto the upper breast that offset this pale tawny to buffy on the upper breast and throat. And what would be the beginnings of a tawny forehead patch and a dark cap and a dark mask. And then very buffy below, and the beginnings of a significantly forked tail. This is a very young, you can see that yellow gape again, indicative of a young bird. This is a very young barn swallow, showing how strange they can look when they're not adults. Everyone knows kids are weird. All right, this one's not really fair. I mean, this bird's identifiable, but it's like, just give people half a second to look at it. I could see how this could lead people to think that it might be a purple martin, but these are in fact both European starlings. No forked tail, pretty square tail, these big long triangular wings, long bill. I think that's all I can really see. But starlings in photographs too. I mean, if you just saw a bird that you thought was a swallow and you didn't look at it with your binoculars and you snapped a photo and you got a backlit photograph that just showed these details, you could lead yourself to think that it might be a purple martin. So binoculars are your friend. So here we have a swallow that is predominantly brown and white. And there are no clean breast bands. There's no clean cut face pattern. We have white undertail coverts, and the brown extends from the breast along the flanks. All of these things point to a northern rough-winged swallow, a really broad-winged swallow. They're broad bases to the wings. But yeah, dingy brown face extending onto the throat, onto the breast, and yeah, no clear-cut patterning anywhere. This is a bird that could, given poor looks, or if you're beginning and looking at birds, could give you the impression of being a violet green swallow because it has nice white rump patches. The tail is much longer. The wings, violet green swallows can appear, they have long, narrow wings, and they can look pretty swifty, but they never look quite as swifty as a swift. And if this bird turned and you could see the underside, it would have a big white spike on its underside and then black. And it is, of course, a white-throated swift. Also has a white throat. It doesn't have the white that comes up around behind the eye. But yeah, these long dagger-like wings point to white-throated swift, or at least point to swift, and then the plumage details point to white-throated swift. So yeah, beware, white rump patches. This is a photo that I found on iNaturalist that I believe Justine Stahl uploaded. And it's an old record from San Clemente Island of a migrant purple martin in spring, presumably one of the Western breeding birds. But this is an adult male showing that long tail. They have like this these like really long undertail, and then the tail finally flares out way out at the back. This long tail and a big head, and then just dark. And it shows the differences in structure between swift and purple martin. Like a black swift would have much narrower, more sickle-like wings, and a long tail, but not as dramatically forked, and a smaller head. Another crummy photo. I wasn't lying about the crummy photos. So this bird shows some field marks. It shows a dark mask. It shows a buffy throat. It shows dark feathering extending below that somewhat darker throat patch. And then it shows all buffy below and a pretty long tail. This is a really bad photo of a barn swallow. No offense to Sally Anderson. I'm sorry, Sally. It is an identifiable photograph, though. Here's another terrible photograph. I'm feeling guilty now that I put all these bad photos in. I thought it was a good idea, but now I'm feeling like maybe I was just being mean. But this bird shows a couple of field marks. And thankfully, even distantly through binoculars, unless you really need new binoculars, birds don't generally look like this. But, field mark, it's important to look at detailed field marks and to, memorize field marks, but it's also important to look at the bird as a whole. And it's also important to look at how the bird's flying, like I mentioned earlier, and where you are. So there's a lot of stuff you can't get from a photograph, of course. Photo ID is a different animal than field ID. Like you'd have a lot of hints about the way this bird was flying and where you were, etc. I purposely left out where any of these were from. But you can still see and pick out some of the details that are nice to look at if you get a quick, if you get like a 2-second view of a bird blasting by Bear Divide, that might really be all you get. I wouldn't recommend that as the best way to learn swallows if you're trying to learn swallows from scratch, or trying to start out learning how to identify swallows. But it is something that ultimately you can get better at by looking at lots of swallows. It is identifying them, identifying birds that you get poor looks at, quick looks at. So this bird shows it shows a white face, and it shows a white throat and a dark face and a little bit of white coming up around behind it. But the thing that really stands out is that you can see the bright white rump patches on this violet green swallow. It's a terrible photograph. I feel bad having included this one. Here's another nice poor photograph showing a dingy breastband, but nothing clear cut. Just some dinginess going on here. Otherwise white below, no real distinct tail fork, but we do have a very obvious dark mask on this bird, and then white below the mask in the throat. And this is a young tree swallow. This bird is mostly brown. It has a long tail. You can't really ascertain whether it has a forked tail or not. It doesn't. It might have a very slight notch at most, but very brown underwings, dingy brown breast, dingy brown face, no clear breastband at all, and these gleaming white undertail coverts all point to northern rough-winged swallow. Brown, always brown, except for that cinnamon edging on young birds, and then these white undertail coverts. Here's a bird in weird lighting, but long, somewhat deeply forked tail, dark overall. Dark, you can't really tell that it's purple, almost appears black, as I mentioned earlier, but this is an adult male purple martin. Broad, large wings. Size is also, if you see a lone swallow above you, 200 feet above you, you can see and determine what the structure of the bird is, what its tail to head ratio is, etc. But size, if it's by itself, is not going to help you. But if you see a flock of tree swallows and there's one giant swallow with it that happens to be a purple martin, then you'll have something to compare for size. So do beware of lone birds flying high above and using size or putting too much into how big you think that bird is. Structure is important, but size can be misleading. Here we have another predominantly brown bird. It has dusky brown on the breast. It has brown tail, brownish, brownish, brownish. And this is another brown northern rough-winged swallow. A photograph taken distantly in heat. All you can see is a dark tail and giant white rump patches. It is a violet green swallow. It's our only bird that has these giant white rump patches, our only regular bird. There are other swallows in the world that have giant white rump patches. There are some potential vagrants to the United States that have an entirely white rump. None of them have occurred in California, so we're not talking about them. If you see something with an entirely white rump with no dark coming down through here, take photographs of it. So here's a nice photograph of a perched swallow, a brown swallow, but it's white below, and it's dingy on the breast. And it has a very obvious dark mask that is quite cleanly defined between the white below and the dark above. And this is a young tree swallow. I'm actually looking at this photograph. Later, somebody can chime in. I'm wondering, this has a little bit of white coming up back at the side of the head. It looks like it could have a more well-defined breastband than I think it does, but I can't really, it's got this slightly paler rump. I don't know, I'm wondering if this isn't the young or crummy looking bank swallow. I'll be curious to hear other people's opinions. I thought northern roughwing swallow was correct identification, but I'm second guessing myself on this. This is not my photograph. It's funny stuff, 2495. So I mean, you know, yeah, I'd like opinions on that bird. Here's a terrible photograph of, oh, not funny stuff 495. We can blame Adam Searcy for this terrible photograph. This is taken on the Oxnard Plain in early fall. Can't see much, but you can see it's white below, brown above. You can see white extending up around behind the face. And you can see a very dark, clear breastband extending down in front of the breast. I got fantastic looks at this bird through binoculars. I did not get great photographs, but this is by this very clean breastband extending down below, white otherwise, white behind in the auriculars, a bank swallow foraging over sod. I am really regretting my decision to have these bad photographs in here. But again, it points out that there are these field marks that you can look for that can be helpful. You can make out that this bird has a forked tail and it's all buffy below and it has tawny on the throat. It's a barn swallow, of course. All brown above, brown face, white undertail coverts, no distinct notched tail. Broad wings, northern roughwing swallow. All right, here's a slightly better photograph. So we see a dark mask, we see a dark cap, we see a tawny forehead patch, we see a slightly paler throat, no dark in the throat, no dark patch here below the throat, no white forehead, gleaming white forehead. This all points to this being a cave swallow, the elusive cave swallow. All right, here's some better photos of some perched birds. So there are two species here. We'll start with the one that most of most of these birds are, and it's glossy blue above, dark mask, all white below, decent tail fork. All points to tree swallow. These are all adult tree swallows. Then we have this guy here, which has a dark breast, and the dark breast has this. It's clean cut. And it has this nice spike extending down the belly. You can see the size difference. This bird's appreciably smaller than these adjacent tree swallows. And you can even see some white wrapping up around behind the auriculars, all point to bank swallow. Nice deep tail fork too. Here's a fun mixed flock. So there are 4 species present in this mixed flock. So let's start up here. Slate blue above, no tail fork. We're gonna ignore that bird. It's a tree swallow, but blue, dark above, clean mask, white below, point to tree swallow. This is a very obvious barn swallow with these big deep tail forks. Here's another barn swallow that is dark above. You can see the chestnut on the throat and forehead, and you can see the long forked tail. This bird as well. We'll get over to here. We have another tree swallow, and this bird shows that little bit of a white side to the rump that they can show. And this bird is tilted, so you're seeing a lot of the undertail coverts, which can give the impression of a more extensive white rump. And then 2 more barn swallows in the middle. You can see those nice long tails. Another tree swallow with the white in the rump. Then we have this guy who has a nice buffy rump and a nice dark face and throat and dark cap and white forehead patch, all point to cliff swallow. And then down here, we have a bird that's mostly white below, but with a clean dark breastband, white extending up around behind the face, and a nice, somewhat deep tail fork, all point to bank swallow. And this is a more realistic idea of like what you'll be looking at if you're looking at a distant group of swallows, other than the fact that they're sitting still. And there's one nice thing about photos is you take a photograph, you can look at it later, and you can at least determine what was there or try and determine what was there. But you do miss out again if you're not just watching the birds. Don't forget to watch birds. We're bird watchers after all. Don't forget about that. Bird photography is fine. I take lots of photographs, and I am very guilty of sometimes taking too many photographs and not looking enough. And you can really miss out on a lot of subtleties. I've tried to tell myself that. I've also just taken too many photos and have too much, have a storage problem. So maybe that's the real reason. All right, we're getting close, everyone. We can open it up for some questions, discussion, etc. Or you can all just flee in terror. Predominantly brown with white underparts, decent little tail fork here, and a very distinct brown breastband with a dark spike coming off of the brown breastband and a brown face with a little bit of white coming up behind the auriculars, all point to bank swallow. A young tree swallow, again, you'll never see this clean cut breastband. And young tree swallows in fall can really be a problem. They can really be a problem, especially if you know there's a bank swallow around and you're trying to find a bank swallow. But they can be a problem just if you're looking for bank swallows and you're not familiar with what young tree swallows can look like. But tree swallows, again, they generally, if they have a dark breastband, it's quite a bit more diffuse, but it's also quite variable. And it tends to be darker on the sides rather than in the middle. It never extends across in this extraordinarily, or in this very clean cut way. And then you have that nice brown spike. Here's just the back of a swallow, but shows plenty of field marks, deep forked tail, deep slaty blue, and you can see just a tiny bit of the chestnut throat of this barn swallow. Another mixed group of swallows. So the dominant bird here is this dark slaty blue backed, chestnut foreheaded, tawny throated bird with long tails that you can't really tell. You can see some of the long tail feathers in this fellow, and they're all barn swallows. And then we have this character here, which shows a buffy rump, and it shows a nice collar extending around behind the face, and it shows a dark cap and a white forehead patch, which is of course cliff swallow. And I think these are bank swallows. I'm pretty sure these are bank swallows. You can see some white wrapping up around behind the face here, and maybe there, and the rump is a little bit paler. Pretty sure those are both bank swallows. Someone could potentially argue that we can't tell, but seeing swallows perched is a great opportunity for study. They'll often do this if the weather's bad or if there's a good food source nearby. They'll eat a bunch and then they'll land on migration in trees, snags. I saw a bunch of northern rough-winged swallows on tules and dead snags here in San Luis Obispo last week, or on Saturday during a rainstorm. They were all just perching and allowed close study, which is a pretty neat thing to do. Very different from flight study. You know, they obviously look very different and you don't get anything about flight style, but a worthwhile, worth your time for sure. So here's a weird young bird. Throat is darker than the breast and belly. It has a dark face and dark cap. Can't really see the detail of the forehead. Dark extends down towards the dividing line between this dark throat patch and dark belly, or tawny, buffy belly. And then we have buffy underwings. This is a young barn swallow. Has not grown even close to a full adult tail, but it does already have a decently long tail that would have a decent fork if it wasn't tilted away from us, banked away from us. White face, can't see any color on the wings, just looks dark, but these big white rump patches and that white face point to violet green swallow. Here's a nice photograph, surprise, surprise, more perched swallows. We have, let's start with this character in the upper left, dark mask, dark cap, some chestnut in the throat and presumably in the forehead. And then slate blue above, that all points to barn swallow. And we have another barn swallow here that's turned towards us, showing some dark extending underneath this throat patch. It's a darker throat on the upper throat, blue cap, buffy below, and you can see the nice forked tail, and you can even see the white tail spots. Then we have this bird in the upper right and this bird in the lower left, which are clean white below, dark slate blue above. You can just see this bird's dark mask, which of course points to adult tree swallow. And then this middle bird, brown cap, white throat, clean brown breast, nice brown spike, all point to a perched bank swallow. That's the end, everyone. Thank goodness. I do have this swallow up that Oscar Johnson, thanks Oscar. I asked him for some photographs and he sent this photo. Looking at it on my phone, I glanced at it and I'd mentioned weird barn swallows and I thought it was just like a weird looking face. I say looking at it on my phone as an excuse for misidentifying it. I would love it if anybody could throw a name on this bird. I'd be impressed. I'm just going to give everybody a hint and say it's not from the United States. It's not from North America. But I saw the forked tail and the white tail spots and I was like, it's this weird looking young barn swallow. And then I passed it off. And he asked about it again. He said, you should use that for sure. And I got suspicious. And then he divulged that it's something else. But if nobody chimes in the chat, I'll tell you all what it is. It's not fair. This is not like an actual quiz. It's a very hard swallow to identify from a continent that has a lot more swallows than we do. So real quick, thanks. iNaturalist has tons of great photos that people put up that have their open license to use for educational purposes. And that's very handy. And I also want to thank John Garrett and Christian Schwartz and Oscar Johnson and John Feenstra for chats, photographs, etc. Not the bird chats, but chatting. And with that, I will open it up for questions if anybody has any questions.
And actually, we have many questions.
Oh boy.
Thank you so much.
I want to remind, yes, thank you. I want to remind everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A. It helps us keep track of them. And we don't want Adam getting mad at us for trying to search through chats, trying to find questions. But in the chat, there are lots and lots of comments about what a wonderful presentation it was, Adam. So
oh boy.
Thank you very much.
Oh, there we go. Show video panel. I'm trying to show people again. There we go. I can see you.
Well, Mark can help out with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so one question from Thomas is, how long do cliff swallows live?
Oh, that is a good question. I don't know the answer to that question, but USGS has a, if I had to guess, I'd say the oldest cliff swallow, I'm guessing here, would be 12 years, but that's a pure guess, just wanted to get it on the record. USGS has banding records for the longest confirmed individuals that have been banded on a website, and that would be something that would be easy to look up. Now, how long they live, unbanded birds, like we don't know, that's just the best that we know, but if someone like John Feenstra or somebody who wants to take a second and look that up, I think it's relatively easy. If you look up USGS bird longevity records or something like that, we could figure it out, but I don't know the answer to it.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see, Beth asks, which swallows besides roughwing excavate tunnels?
Bank swallows. I think bank swallows are the only ones that excavate their own. I want to say that roughwing swallows have to use pre-existing cavities, but I don't know that that's true. Identification is more my strong point than swallow natural history. I want to know, but I don't know the answer to that question. I know bank swallows excavate their own cavities, but most of the other swallows rely on cavities that other birds or other things have made. And I think that's the case with northern roughwing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything, apparently. That's two questions. That's two questions, and I'm 0 for 2. Let's keep going.
Okay, here we go. Let's try another one. So,
11 years, 10 months? Sorry.
Wow,
I said 12 years.
11 years, 10, 12, that's what, 11 years, 12, 10 months?
I got 12 years on the record. I just want everybody.
That was really close. Okay.
Adam, all the thoughts we had about you before are now gone.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's, yeah. So that's for a cliff swallow is 11 years, 10 months. So that's from 10.
It's amazing.
But that was, yeah. So the 12 years was a really close there. So Nancy asks, I saw a tree swallow carrying nest material. Do they line the tree cavity before laying eggs?
Yes. Yeah, they line it with fine plant material and feathers. So here's something. There's something I do know. They line it with a lot of different kinds of feathers, and the best way to see this is to if you volunteer at some kind of tree swallow nest box monitoring program and you check the nests from time to time or clean the nests out at the end of the year. They're pretty disgusting at the end of the year, but early on, if you're doing nest checks to see if there are eggs or young, etc., you see the freshly lined nests, and you'll see duck feathers, you'll see crow feathers, hawk feathers. I remember once I found an oriole feather. There's just one orange feather in there. But one neat thing is that feathers are a premium around tree swallow nesting areas. And at the Saticoy settling ponds in Ventura County, if you found a feather or just brought a feather, you could walk up to the edge of the ponds when it was windy and the wind was behind you, and you could let it go off over the water. And within seconds, multiple tree swallows would go after it and fight over it because it really is at a premium. I mean, you imagine, I think there are like 100 nest boxes there. You imagine all these swallows trying to nest 100 nests with feathers. I mean, I see feathers around on the ground, but I don't see hundreds of feathers. And if each nest needs, let's say 100 feathers, and that's like, it's like 1,000 feathers pretty quickly. So yeah, so it's a hot commodity. So it's pretty fun. If you find a feather and let it go, you'll just see the swallows get really excited It's like feeding ducks, but not harmful. So
Very cool. Got to try that with the feather.
yeah, do it.
Yeah. Thomas asked, do all swallows have the same lifespan?
The answer to that must be no, but I don't know how they differ and in what ways they differ. I mean, there are resident tropical swallows in the tropics globally. Swallows on every continent except Antarctica. And I assume that there are significant differences between migratory and non-migratory swallows. I don't know what those average differences would be.
Wonderful. Okay. Let's see. We have a question about one of the photos. Did it have something in its beak? I think that was probably in the one of the cliff swallows photos.
Yeah, I made a mental note of which swallow photo it was, and I've now forgotten.
Okay, but I think it was one of the cliff swallows. Maybe it was the ones that were thinking about gravitational waves, which I know they clearly do. As you so kindly mentioned, but no, I think it was a it was a cliff, not a cave.
Yeah,
this guy has a bug.
That guy's a bug, but I think
So
it was
this young bird.
Yeah.
No, I think I know which one it was, and I do think that there's a bird. Yeah. So I think that is my guess would be a moth. I think it's food. I think it's an insect, and that bird's probably bringing food back to a nest. Mud, you wouldn't. I don't think.
No.
Yeah, it's not mud, so that's the only other thing this bird should be carrying, unless it's a manuscript that it's bringing to submit for an upcoming publication on gravitational waves. So.
Exactly.
Could be that.
Oh, here we go. We got ages of our swallows. 13
right.
years, 9 months. Oh, look at that. Purple Martin.
Wow, Ted is on in here. Okay.
Good.
Oh,
But also,
Martins are old.
Just as an aside, that website is a neat thing to look at if you're ever curious about how what the oldest birds are that we've recorded. Again, we don't know. This is just birds that we have banded that have been recovered or have been encountered multiple times.
Yeah.
So birds, the assumption is that they can live longer than all of these records because most birds aren't banded.
Two things. Ted put the website address in the chat, so grab that if you want it. Second thing, northern rough-winged swallow, less than 6 years. Wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
That might just be maybe we don't band as many and it just hasn't happened yet. So who knows?
It might be.
Yeah,
it's a rough life.
It is.
Oh, especially for
it's a jungle out there.
That's good. That's
another question popped up, Mark.
Yeah, you certainly given us a lot to swallow here.
Yeah.
Which swallows nest in the LA area?
Are there any current known Purple Martin locations in the mountains, or is that pretty much
not in LA County as far as I know?
I think we have to go to Ventura.
Yeah, well, the Tejon area, Santa Barbara. So Purple Martin doesn't anymore. Violet green nests in the mountains. Tree swallows nest in the lowlands. You don't have barn swallows, do you? Is it too far south, or do you get occasional barns? I know they become common on the coast north of Santa Barbara, I think, and they're on the Channel Islands. No, maybe San Clemente Island. Cliff swallows, northern rough-winged swallows, and I think banks are all extirpated from LA County, right?
Yeah.
I think that's all of them, isn't it?
So Lance says that barn swallows do nest in LA County somewhere.
Interesting. Yeah, I would assume they'd be pretty scarce in LA County, but
yeah.
Thanks, Lance.
Interesting. Well, I think we have run out of questions. Oh, no, actually, Ted asks.
Ted asks.
Oh, wow, JPL.
What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow?
I feel guilty and I feel bad. I was actually going to include the best, the most up-to-date scientific information about the carrying capacity of each species of swallow that I covered tonight. And I did not. And I was going to, I think the only species we know potentially could carry a coconut is the Purple Martin, but I think all the other ones were data deficient on.
Well, exactly. Ted has already pointed out that the speed for a excuse me, where are we?
An unladen swallow.
For an unladen swallow, 24 miles per hour. That's
Oh, wow.
really quick.
Amazing.
That is. That is.
Uh,
Try and do that on your bike. That's really fast.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. This has been not only informative but very entertaining.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
I think
Glad you enjoyed it,
everyone.
Ron.
I think everyone really enjoyed it.
And
before
of
you
course,
go.
wait. One more question, the important one, really important one, that John said. What swallow is in Oscar's photo? The last photo that you had.
Oh yeah.
Goodness, I almost forgot. It is a Prius's swallow, Preuss's swallow, Preuss''S. And it is an African swallow that used to be in the genus Hirundo, but is now considered a petrochelidon, like our cliff and cave swallows. So thanks, Oscar Johnson.
And thank you, John,
Yeah.
for reminding us to.
Yeah,
go
a
back.
weird swallow from Africa. Africa has some really cool
Yes.
swallows.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Anyways, thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation, webinar tonight. We really appreciate it. And next month we have, next month already. Wow. In May, we have a couple of great presentations coming up. So please, if you're not a member, become a member and get notification of whatever webinars we have coming up. We also have pelagics and field trips. What else do we have, Mark?
Yeah, that's pretty much
Covering it? Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty much covering it. Just go to labirders.org and you can see what's going on and what's coming in the future.
Absolutely.
Birding 101 too.
And yep, we don't have Birding 101 coming in the near future, but in the fall, hopefully we'll have another one. And we've gotten a lot of great comments about how lovable the blurry photos were. So thank you very much. And with that, thank you all very much. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you on the webinar on Zoom or out in the field sometime the next month. Thank you, Adam, again for a wonderful webinar. And
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah,
We'll
thank you.
and with that, we'll see everyone soon. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.
Goodbye.